Chapter 8 Tricks and Techniques, Variety and Vitality. How to add color, rhythm, pace, and emotion. Earlier in this book, I advised you to be true to yourself. Speak in your natural style. I will now go back on this advice. If your natural style is monotonous, you really should try to find another one. If you are writing for someone else who is monotonous, find something new for him or her. Anyone's speech will benefit from color, rhythm, pace, emotion, and above all, variety. An audience cannot abide the same voice for too long. You can achieve all of these things without being artificial and untrue to yourself. Here are some tricks and techniques which can help. As before, when you try them out, you will probably find that you have used them or heard them frequently in ordinary life. As before, you should test them by ear, talk them through, and hear yourself saying them, or hear the person you are writing for. But you can also test them usefully by eye. Look at your speech as it appears on the page. Can you see sentences and paragraphs of different lengths? If so, it is a healthy sign. A mix of long and short sentences and long and short paragraphs is a sign that your speech will have variety. In fact, it will virtually force you to give vocal interest to your speech and change the pitch and pace of your delivery. I got rhythm. Every great speech contains rhythm, and more than one rhythm. As in music, rhythm acts very strongly on the subconscious of listeners. It can make them excited or reflective, happy or angry, playful or serious, and above all, a strong rhythm keeps them in step with you. Although there are particular devices which help to generate rhythm, notably repetition and using words in pairs, most speeches develop their rhythm by using simple words and using them logically. That means grouping words tightly so that each group represents one complete thought. To illustrate this, I took extra care over the last paragraph. If I break it down into its separate clauses and phrases, you should see that each one finishes off a particular thought and allows the next one to express another thought. Every great speech contains rhythm, and more than one rhythm, as in music. Rhythm acts very strongly on the subconscious of listeners. It can make them excited or reflective, happy or angry, playful or serious, and above all, not a thought, but a warning to pay attention. A strong rhythm keeps them in step with you. It is not poetry, but that paragraph is easy to speak aloud. I could have written the first paragraph differently as, the presence of rhythm, and indeed of more than one rhythm, is a mark of every great speech. Rhythm, in terms of creating moods of excitement or reflection, happiness or anger, playfulness or seriousness, as in music, acts strongly on the subconscious of listeners. A strong rhythm, it should be emphasized, is instrumental in creating a strong linkage between listeners and yourself. Try speaking that aloud. I have broken the link between ideas and groups of words and forced you to reach the end of a meandering sentence before you know what you have said, and I have probably left you gasping for breath. If you look again at my bad paragraph, you will notice that I severed the subject from the main verb. This is sheer cruelty. Subjects and main verbs love being together, and if you keep them together, you will go a long way toward creating happy, rhythmic sentences. Other groups of words also like to be kept together, although not as passionately as subject and verb. If you have a group of words in a sentence which modifies its subject or its verb, or its object, it will probably read best if it stays close to the thing it modifies, and if it stays close to other groups of words doing the same job. Try out this sentence. Felix the cat delighted American movie audiences, who recognized in his endless ingenuity and unquenchable optimism a kindred spirit and a symbol of the age. I hope you find it jerky and unhappy. Try it again as, endlessly ingenious and unquenchably optimistic, Felix the cat delighted American movie audiences, who recognized him as a kindred spirit and a symbol of the age. I hope you find it flows better when the words modifying Felix are moved alongside him. If any sentence does not seem to have the right rhythm, or any at all, try first cutting out the dead wood. See Chapter 10. If that has not cured the problem, try rearranging the word order until it does. It will probably make more sense as well. Now read the paragraph by John Donne in the appendix. Read it aloud. Donne was a great poet who also became a legendary preacher. The passage is part of a sermon to a packed congregation at Old St. Paul's. Notice the intense rhythms as you speak it. Notice too how they are built on simple language. Notice in particular that Donne achieves his most dramatic change of rhythm by the 5 simplest words in the passage. Now God comes to thee. Notice finally that each cluster of words represents one thought, and that although many of the sentences are long, the subjects are always close to their main verbs. If you organize simple words logically and listen to yourself as you do so, you should find yourself creating effective, rhythmic passages to speak. However, if you are particularly interested in rhythm, you may find it worthwhile to do 2 special exercises. The first is to mark the places in a passage of writing where you would expect you or your speaker to draw breath. They should fall at the end of a phrase or complete sentence, and in a rhythmic passage, they should fall at regular intervals. A change in these intervals should mean a deliberate change of rhythm, but if the breathing intervals are all over the place, then the speech has probably lost its rhythm. The second is to write out the passage as lines of poetry. Go further and mark in the long and short syllables, and where the main stresses fall. In a rhythmic passage, you should see lines of a similar length, and some sort of pattern in the syllables and stresses. Changes of pace. Not surprisingly, most of the points we have just established about rhythm apply equally to pace. By using simple language logically, you can achieve effective and essential changes of pace in your speech. However, there is one key difference. With rhythm, you are working primarily with sound. With pace, you are working with sense. Indeed, the whole point of changing the pace of your speech is to suit the sense of what you are saying and make the audience respond to it in the right way. Almost every great speech changes pace several times. It is slow when the speaker wants his or her audience to stop and think, or laugh, cry, or rage, and fast when he or she wants them to hurry on to the next point or to the conclusion. Even a very short speech will have changes of pace. Read Lincoln's Gettysburg Address again, all 269 words of it. After the stately biblical opening of 7 years ago, the rest of the first sentence hurries on to its conclusion. Lincoln wanted his audience to agree quickly to his starting proposition. It contains a statement which was highly contentious in its time. All men are created equal. And he did not want them to stop and think about it. But then, he deliberately slows the second sentence down with 2 enforced pauses, before and after the words between the dashes. Having got the audience to accept quickly that the United States was founded in liberty and equality, Lincoln wants them to think in earnest whether it can endure. We have already noticed in passing some techniques which great speakers have used to slow things down, as when Churchill uses the elaborate word subjugated. John Donne, even more elaborately, uses Latin, panem quotidianum, before translating it as daily bread. He stops his listeners cold, and then makes them listen again to a key concept. Here are some other common devices which make a speech travel faster or slower. For acceleration, you might try repeating a short phrase. We shall fight on the... Without repeating the same phrase, you can achieve the same effect by repeating the same construction. Here is Churchill again, attacking the Munich settlement in 1938. There can never be friendship between the British democracy and the Nazi power. That power which spurns Christian ethics, which cheers its onward course by a barbarous paganism, which vaunts the spirit of aggression and conquest, which derives strength and perverted pleasure from persecution, and uses, as we have seen, with pitiless brutality, the threat of murderous force. That passage also contains 2 other familiar devices for acceleration. There is alliteration, repeating words with the same initial letter, perverted pleasure from persecution. Churchill also uses a matching construction, instead of actually repeating a construction, which, He uses a matching construction in a way which gives equal weight to the two things which are matched together. Uses, with pitiless brutality, the threat of murderous force. This latter one is characteristically Churchillian. Use it with caution if you want to avoid sounding like an inferior copy. In the John Donne passage, notice how much momentum he builds with the use of repeated pairs of adjectives. Withered and frozen, clouded and eclipsed, damped and benumbed, smothered and stupefied, until the 5 words which stop the listeners dead. We are going to say more about pairs and trios in the section called Pairs and Trios. In the context of pace, pairs tend to speed things up. Trios, words organized in groups of 3, have great pace when the trio belong naturally together. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. But they stop a speech short when the third member is a deliberate surprise. In the same accident, he managed to break his arm, his leg, and his promise. One of the simplest ways to accelerate a speech is to begin sentences with connecting words. But, moreover, however, in other words, this means that, and in a speech, it is perfectly all right to begin a sentence with and. To slow a speech down, you can simply create pauses. A new paragraph, full stop, a colon, a dash, or a parenthesis entail a pause. But this is not necessarily true of a question mark. See below on rhetorical questions. As we have seen, you can use unusual words and constructions to slow a speech down. But even more effectively, you can use a series of strong one-syllable words. Now God comes to thee. There is an analogy here with songwriting. A one-syllable rhyme, moon, June, is known as a masculine rhyme, and a multi-syllable rhyme, greenery, scenery, is a feminine rhyme. Feminine rhymes are often favored for fast, witty, patter songs. Masculine rhymes are usually preferred in slow, romantic ballads. It is a common mistake to imagine that short sentences accelerate a speech. A sentence always ends in a pause, and the more pauses you have, the more slowly you will speak. Ultra-short sentences bring a speech virtually to a halt, especially a whole string of them, with no main verbs. If it is properly constructed, if words are grouped logically around ideas, if rhetorical devices are deployed in an exciting but appropriate way, a long sentence can have far more momentum than a short one. Sometimes the same device can be used to speed things up or slow things down. A vivid metaphor or simile speeds things up if it is instantly comprehensible, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, and slows things down if the audience needs to think about it. My opponent floats like a bee and stings like a butterfly. A question slows things right down if you want the audience to answer it in their minds or directly from the floor. How many people here have been victims of a crime in the last year? But you may ask what is called a rhetorical question, which you intend to answer yourself. Why do the crime figures always lie? In that case, you should ask and answer it quickly before someone in the audience supplies the wrong answer. Statistics are another weapon you can use either way. A string of simple statistics builds a great deal of pace if they all point to the same basic conclusion. An example might be, small businesses in Oblivia with less than 50 employees employ nearly 2/3 of the nation's workers. Just over a quarter of all Oblivion workers are either self-employed or work for businesses with less than 10 people. Small businesses accounted for 68% of the growth in GDP over the last 5 years, and for no less than 86% of the new jobs created. In Oblivia today, a new business is formed every 5 minutes. The figures all tell you that small businesses are really important in Oblivia. But a quirky statistic slows a speech down, as does a string of statistics with an unusual conclusion. An example might be, last year the average Oblivion family spent $50 on charity appeals for victims of starvation, $747 on appeals from religious evangelists, and $2,142 on guns and ammunition. If you want your audience to agree with something quickly, especially something contentious, express it quickly and simply as an accomplished fact. If you want them to ponder something, express it slowly in a more complex way, with more exotic words and information, perhaps asking deliberate questions. You may even deliberately mystify your audience and leave them to guess where you are taking them. This can build suspense and grab attention, but do not keep the mystery going for too long. Finally, humor can be either speedy or slow. For speed, you tell a string of one-liners. To slow things down, you tell a story. Figures of speech. In this section, we are going to look at a number of recognized figures of speech. Two of them are built into its title. Figures of speech is a metaphor and a pun. If it did its job properly, it made you smile and made you think. People often use their fingers to make a point, sometimes very directly and without the aid of speech. Young children use their fingers to paint with. Think of this next series of devices as something you can use to point or to paint. We will look at their strengths and their hazards. Alliteration. Using repeated words or syllables with the same letter or sound, usually a consonant. An Austrian army artfully arrayed. Boldly by battery besieges Belgrade. This is a stock device of great orators. We have seen one from Churchill. Perverted pleasure from persecution. And I heard a good moderate example recently from an opponent of Tony Blair, who accused the Prime Minister of allowing his critics to be exposed to the spite and spleen of his spin doctors. Alliteration gives pause and emphasis. In the modern example, the repeated SP sound creates a special venom, and a short alliteration often sticks in the memory, particularly those beginning with the letter L. Limousine, liberal, liberal lizard, lagerlout. However, at its worst, alliteration sounds stilted and overblown, as in the early 1970s, when Vice President Spiro Agnew perpetrated nattering nabobs of negatism to attack the American media. Anacoluthon. Deliberately changing the grammar of a sentence. This can be very effective after a long list, when the sudden change can wake an audience from a hypnotic trance. Although they do not come from a speech, there are some particularly effective examples in the Bible. The rest of all the acts of Asa, and all his might, and all that he did, and the cities which he built, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? King James Version, 1 Kings 15:23. This is followed by a superb bathos, anticlimax. Nevertheless, in the time of his old age, he was diseased in his feet. The danger of an anacoluthon is that people may not recognize it as deliberate. They may simply think you have lost your way in a sentence. The following anacoluthon by George Bush Sr., explaining his position on abortion, was probably unintentional. Well, it appears to a double standard to some, but that's my position, and we don't have time to philosophically discuss it here, but we're going to opt on the side of life. Anaphora. Beginning a word or phrase at the beginning of a successive sentence. We shall fight on the... and its companion, antistrophe, repeating it at the end. Franklin Roosevelt used this device when he announced Pearl Harbor to the American people. In 1931, 10 years ago, Japan invaded Manchukuo without warning. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia without warning. In 1938, Hitler occupied Austria without warning. In 1939, Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia without warning. Later, in 1939, Hitler invaded Poland without warning. And now, Japan has attacked Malay and Thailand and the United States without warning. Both devices give speeches a strong sense of rhythm, and they make ideas lodge in listeners' minds. Roosevelt did this so successfully that no one noticed that several of his examples were wrong. Antithesis. Presenting contrasting ideas in an identical construction. The more I know men, the more I like dogs. a simple device which makes a contrast more memorable. Climax. Building words, phrases, or ideas in sequence from those of least to those of greatest power. I do not like him. I do not trust him. I do not respect him. He is a liar and a traitor and an evildoer. Every speech should have a climax, but only one at the end of your speech. Its opposite number, bathos, usually creates laughter, usually accidentally, sometimes intentionally. I do not trust him. I do not respect him. He is a liar and a traitor and an evildoer, and I do not even like him. Euphemism. Using a softer substitute for a word with unpleasant associations, such as passed away for died. They have become particularly prevalent among military people who used to be famous for speaking plainly, so that civilian casualties have become collateral damage. The modern age has produced a series of sickly euphemisms for mass murder and genocide. Political correctness has added a new crop of euphemisms, such as alternatively cerebral for stupid, to protect selected groups of people and animals, plants, and even non-living things from the associations of everyday speech. In general, avoid euphemism. At best, it makes you sound mealy-mouthed. At worst, dishonest. However, for certain audiences, a euphemism has become established, and not using it carries a risk of deliberate discourtesy. For example, it is now a mistake to talk about old or elderly people. The polite term is older people. However, you may well exploit euphemisms for irony. See below. The village was targeted for close air support, i.e., bombed, and a number of pre-adult civilian personnel were collaterally damaged. Children were killed. Hyperbole. Exaggeration. President Nixon used it sincerely, if questionably, when the astronauts first landed on the moon. This is the greatest week in the history of the world since the creation. Because of its associations with the lower reaches of advertising, PR, and media, most speakers now use hyperbole ironically to mock their opponents or, more rarely, themselves. The minister will be delighted to know that his speech on agricultural waste has caused dancing in the streets of my constituency. Grown men embraced each other and wept openly. Old people gazed at each other in disbelief that such a day had come at last. Irony. A statement which superficially means one thing, but in fact conveys the exact opposite meaning to those who truly understand it. And Brutus was an honorable man. When you use irony, it is as if you were saying, not, or, yeah, right, to your audience. Irony is a marvelous but dangerous weapon. At its best, it demolishes your opponent's position, and in debate, it may actually provoke your opponent into a foolish outburst. It can make your audience laugh, and it flatters them by thinking them smart enough to understand your hidden meaning. But irony has three allied dangers. First, it depends on your ability, or your speaker's ability, to convey the hidden meaning by vocal mannerism. If you, or he or she, cannot manage this, do not attempt irony or write it into your speaker's remarks. Second, in spite of your best vocal efforts, or your speakers, the audience may simply not detect the hidden meaning. This is especially true for audience members who are unfamiliar with English, for irony is a distinctly English style. Third, irony is often hard to detect in print. The printed form of your speech will not convey your mannerisms, adopting boring sing-song voice with mocking smile. The reader could take it at face value. Read the extract of the speech by Dr. Tony Wright, MP, at the end of this book. Are you certain he did not mean it? Meiosis. The opposite of hyperbole, deliberate understatement. The most famous meiosis in history was said by Emperor Hirohito of Japan, broadcasting the news of the atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The situation has developed not necessarily to our advantage. In a less grim context, meiosis is frequently used for ironic effect, particularly by English people. Rummaging in my attic the other day, I found a first folio edition of Shakespeare, which was nice. Metaphor and simile. We have already encountered these when discussing analogy. They are especially ways of comparing things which are unlike in order to bring out their surprising similarities. A simile does this job with linking words, like, as if. A metaphor does it by identifying the two things directly. A great many jokes are built on similes. Why is a like a? And you can often use this technique yourself to good effect if you can find an exotic comparison and then explain it. But remember, as we said earlier, that metaphors and similes work when they make a fair and logical comparison. They can then combine an unforgettable image and an unforgettable idea. They do not work at all when they depend on words alone, and they will invariably puzzle and annoy your audience. A few general tips on metaphors and similes. 1. Many metaphors are delivered effectively in the form of A is the X of Y, as in, he is the Homer Simpson of British politics. 2. You can often work an effective switch on a simple metaphor or simile. He is like Homer Simpson without the brains, although this technique is teetering on the edge of cliché. 3. A metaphor or simile can be as long or as short as you like. In old times, writers and speakers used to employ long, sustained metaphors. Read the dedication of the King James Bible, with its long image of the king as a new sun dispelling the dark clouds which had formed after the extinction of the star of Queen Elizabeth. My former boss, Dennis Healy, revived the technique to good effect with a sustained comparison of Margaret Thatcher and John Major to Lucy and Charlie Brown. See Appendix. By sustaining the metaphor, he made his listeners locate his political opponents in a cartoon world. If you do use a sustained simile or metaphor, make sure that its comparisons remain consistently logical. Margaret Thatcher and John Major really were like Lucy and Charlie Brown. 4. Metaphors and similes often hunt well in pairs. In the criminal underworld of disease, bacteria are muggers and viruses are squatters. Bacteria knock you down openly in the street. Viruses sneak into your house and take it over. 5. Mixed metaphors are usually funny by accident. Britain's post-war Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, produced a spectacular example. If you open up that Pandora's box, you don't know what Trojan horses might come jumping out. If you were very daring, you might want to achieve this effect deliberately. The president is playing cocktail piano in the depths of an ocean of sleaze. But as with irony, you had better be sure that your audience will get it. 6. A good metaphor does not always have to use an everyday image. One of the greatest and enduring metaphors, Iron Curtain, is a weird image, but it is easy to imagine, and it was superbly logical in its context. Iron Curtain is unusual in having such a long and active life. Most metaphors do not survive their initial flight. Others turn into zombies, the living dead, in the twilight zone of cliché. Political football must have been fresh once, as were its companions, level playing field, and moving the goalposts. You can have a lot of fun with clichés, by deliberately sustaining them or by running them together. The government has treated the health service as a political football, but it keeps moving the goalposts for health and service managers. There is no level playing field between health authorities, and it is no wonder that no one listens to the minister when he blows the whistle as a referee. Some almost dead metaphors twitch into life in the wrong company. A grassroots initiative is a cliched way of describing any idea which springs from people, cliché alert, on the ground. It is usually a harmless thing to say, but when a British minister called for grassroots initiatives to transform our urban parks and green spaces, it produced an unexpected image of planting new lawns. Oxymoron and paradox. Paradox is saying something apparently illogical, but which in fact makes sense. Groucho Marx's remark, "I don't want to belong to any club that would have me as a member," is an example. An oxymoron is specialized paradox, putting two apparently contradictory words together. Inspired stupidity, exquisite torture. Many speakers now get a cheap joke out of explaining the term. It's an oxymoron, like deeply shallow or military intelligence. But this is becoming passionately boring. Paradox works if it is instantly understandable, like Groucho Marx's. If you need to explain a paradox, put the explanation before you deliver the paradox. Here's an example. Gordon Brown relies on the Treasury forecast of the economy. The Treasury forecast looks at no fewer than 357 economic variables, things that can affect the economy. So it has 357 things which can go wrong. Compare this to a horse. A horse has just 4 legs which can go wrong. So it would be far safer for Gordon Brown to bet all the nation's money on a horse. Pleonasm and tautology. Pleonasm means deliberately using extra words which add nothing to a concept. Well, I've never seen anything like that in all my born days. Tautology means saying the same thing twice or more in different words. Do not despair, be of good cheer. These devices were used regularly in the past to give rhythm to speeches and emphasis to key ideas. Today, they are becoming gifts for satirists. The past is behind us, the future lies ahead. I would like to exchange words with a speechwriter who persuaded Vice President Dan Quayle to say, "If we don't succeed, we run the risk of failure." Puns. Using a word or a sound with 2 different meanings at the same time or in the same context to produce an unexpected or amusing effect. My lizard keeps telling jokes. Your lizard keeps telling jokes? Yes, he's a stand-up chameleon. Any pun is a high-risk strategy. It is another very English form of humor, and many of your audience may not get it if they are not well versed in the English language. Even if they do get it, many will affect to despise puns and will groan ostentatiously. Be prepared for this, or your timing will suffer. For that reason, puns often work best in rapid clusters, so that each one tops the previous one and does not allow the audience to dwell on it. This was a good cluster in an entertaining speech about bad gardening. In my garden, a fuchsia has no future. A clematis becomes a clamortis. A nasturtium becomes a nasty urtium. A begonia is a begoner, and an aster turns into a disaster. Puns should not be labored. If you cannot work them naturally and seamlessly into a single sentence, discard them. Like all jokes and humor, a pun should be relevant, not a piece of incidental entertainment. Rhetorical question. Asking a question which the speaker intends to answer immediately in his or her own words. It can be a very effective device, particularly if you want to shut down other replies to an open-ended and contentious question. The big risk is that someone will answer it before you do. British Prime Minister Harold Wilson was discomfited many years ago in a campaign appearance in a naval town when he asked, "Why do I stress the importance of the Navy?" And someone shouted out, "Because you're in Chatham!" Numbers are metaphors. Many years ago at college, I used to read China Pictorial, the color magazine which was sent to us free by Chairman Mao's government. It always contained fascinating, detailed statistics. In the anti-pest campaign in Fujian province, guided by Mao Zedong, though, 5,617,987 bugs were eradicated. I always wondered if someone counted each individual bug. Instead, I was told at the time that the Chinese treated numbers as metaphors, not necessarily literally true, but denoting a lot or a little. The more precise the number, the more important it was. Although it is still important to get numbers right, there is something to be learned from those copies of China Pictorial. There is no point in using a number at all, unless it conveys an impression of magnitude. We have already discussed in Chapter 7 some techniques for making numbers relevant to an audience, such as dividing big numbers into smaller familiar ones and finding sensible comparators. China Pictorial was right to use very precise numbers. They do make people think. It is very easy to do this yourself, especially if you link the very precise number to something that cannot be precise or even measured at all. It is a scientific fact that 86.74% of all males over 15 need at least 5 minutes to put a duvet cover back on a duvet. Incidentally, the words, "it is a scientific fact," in a speech nearly always mean the complete opposite. When you are talking about the time of some future event, It is often very effective to identify it precisely. Compare, "At this rate of destruction, the Amazon rainforest will have disappeared by 2030, to, "At this rate, the last tree in the Amazon will be cut down on the 5th of July, 2029, at 5:37 p.m. local time." Pairs and trios. At the risk of seeming obsessive, I recommend yet again that you keep alert in your speech for opportunities to use pairs and trios. We have already seen examples of what they can achieve in the right hands. Pairs of words can give your speech music. Pairs of ideas lend themselves naturally to contrast and comparison. Both these effects can be found in the same sentence of the Gettysburg Address. "The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here. We can never forget what they did here." A trio, ideas organized in clusters of 3, can give your speech tremendous momentum. A trio automatically conveys a sense of progress. You can use it to build a crescendo from A to B to C. "I came, I saw, I conquered." Or equally to achieve surprise by going from A to B to D. "I came, I saw, I went home." As we have seen earlier, groups of 3 are the easiest number for an audience to remember. St. Paul knew that when he said, "Now there abideth 3 things, faith, hope, and charity." The world's armies know that when they issue orders in 3s. Ready, aim, fire. 3 is the ideal number for any list. If you must have more than 3 items on a list, make it 5, not 4, because any odd number is more memorable than any even number. 7 is definitely too many for a list. Try remembering instantly each one of the 7 dwarves. Stop me if you've heard this before. Humor is a terrible risk in any speech. It takes a professional comedian years of training and a million cold audiences. "You could have stored meat in them," to learn to make people laugh. Why should you be able to do it as an amateur? No speech actually needs humor. Even a speech intended for entertainment does not have to be humorous. You can entertain people by being interesting and interested in them, far better than telling a string of jokes, however hilarious. Many sports personalities try to convert themselves into comedians when they go on the after-dinner speaking circuit. A few succeed very well, but the rest would do better to say what it is really like to be a professional sports person, or better still, give a master class. If you must be a humorist, at least avoid making mistakes. The biggest mistake is irrelevance. Humor works when it is integrated into your speech, making the points you want remembered, not when it is poured in from outside in the hope of making it more entertaining. Humor should be part of the hamburger, not the ketchup. The second biggest mistake is offense. It is no good grumbling about political correctness, but you really cannot make a joke in any audience about race, disability, religion, gender, age, sexual orientation, nationality, illness, or size. A British politician recently lost her job for a joke about race in what she thought was a safe audience, and rightly so. There are no safe audiences anymore, and even if there were, it has become bad manners and a sign of a limited mind to make a joke at any formal occasion which uses these aspects of human life in a stereotyped way. Is that how you want to be remembered? It is equally wrong to tell jokes which rely on bad language or references to sex, drug abuse, including alcohol, and rude bodily functions, especially the elimination of any form of waste. Although they may not be obviously offensive, it is foolish to tell any jokes which rely on a special accent or mannerism. It is also wise to avoid any jokes about contemporary politics and any jokes against a current celebrity. You do not know how many fans he or she has in the audience. As you can see, there are not many jokes left. The third mistake is to tell jokes against your audience. Most speakers have enough sense to avoid insulting their audience collectively, but it is quite easy to insult a group by insulting one member of it. If you are talking to a convention of dentists, do not tell any story, however fascinating or hilarious, about any current dentist, however far away from this particular convention. Your joke dentist is still a fellow professional to them. It is far better to tell a funny story about a dentist in history, which makes no judgment on the profession now, and by implication, compliments the audience for their advances in dentistry. A more common mistake is to tell too many stories against yourself. You are their distinguished guest speaker. Do not leave them to remember you as a klutz. Do not tell esoteric jokes or stories which force an audience to know too much or to understand too much fine English. It is extraordinarily difficult to judge what references any audience can be expected to understand without explanation. In the 1930s, it was commonplace for British politicians to quote Dickens. They could expect to be understood because thousands of homes had complete sets of Dickens, given away in the newspaper circulations war of the time. Newspapers do not use that form of promotion today, and British politicians will now talk about sport or television rather than Dickens. However, if for some reason you want to make a very obscure reference, you may obtain a humorous and flattering effect by assuming that your audience knows it already, as it might be, "We all remember the wise words of the 17th century Swedish Chancellor Oxenstierna." A much worse mistake than being esoteric is to tell any joke or story in which you have to pretend to be a member of the same group as the audience. It will simply show how clearly you are not. Humorous quotations can leaden the lightest speech, and people have usually heard them already. I dislike hearing quotations of any kind in speeches. All quotations, however brilliant, are second-hand words and second-hand thoughts. However, you can sometimes achieve an entertaining effect by using quotations indirectly in a throwaway style. "The goal made a big difference to the team. All the players stiffened their sinews, and some even summoned up the blood." You can often get more humor from a weird fact or story, or even a single weird sentence, than from a set-piece joke or story. One of my favorites is the weird but commonplace sign which says, "Dogs must be led beyond this point." I imagine hordes of puzzled pedestrians looking desperately for a dog to lead beyond the point. I also enjoy, "The door is alarmed." So what? I'm terrified. A joke or story dies as soon as a speaker says, "That reminds me of the story." Humor in a speech should be like an expensive hairpiece, and no one should see the join. In my view, any one-liner is always better than any long story. It takes less time, it is easier to slide it in, and above all, you are less likely to forget it or to stumble over some vital element in the build-up. In terms of actual delivery, a common mistake in telling a joke or story is not to pause for a laugh. An even commoner mistake is pausing for a laugh when there is clearly not going to be one. The biggest mistake of all is to comment in any way on the absence of a laugh. Summary. A speech needs color, rhythm, pace, emotion, and variety. There are many tricks and techniques to achieve color and variety. Test them by ear. Some you can also test by eye, the length of sentences and paragraphs on the page. Simple words and logical groups can generate a natural rhythm. Keep subjects and verbs close together. Great speeches have changes of pace. You can achieve this through both sound and sense. Speed your speech up when you want your audience to accept something quickly. Slow it down when you want them to think. Sometimes the same technique, metaphor, statistics, humor, trios, can be used as an accelerator or as a brake. There are well-established figures of speech which can be used to add color and make a point more memorable. Some are dangerous, especially irony. Metaphors and similes are immensely varied and flexible, but they should always be logical. Metaphors can turn all too quickly into cliches. Numbers have a role as metaphors. When you use them, be certain that they mean something big or something small to your audience. Pairs of words or phrases can give a speech music and bring home a contrast or comparison. Trios, ideas in clusters of 3, are especially easy to remember. They can build momentum, crescendo, or surprise. Humor is a high risk. Make humor relevant and understandable and slide it easily into your speech. Do not cause offense. Short passages of humor usually work better than long stories. Be prepared for humor to fail.